Wanted to make a video here talking about a Python project I've been working on called Scrapli. Scrapli is a Python screen scraping library, and Scrapli was originally intended to be used with networking devices, but really it can be used with anything that you can interact with over SSH or Telnet. And Scrapli's kind of purpose in life is kind of a modern take on a kind of a old problem at this point of actually just trying to deal with scraping data out of a SSH or Telnet session, which is obviously pretty painful and pretty irritating problem to deal with. So Scrapli's purpose is basically to abstract all of that away, make it as kind of painless as possible, provide you a well-documented, well-typed, well-tested, kind of just modern Python API so that you can interact with your device just like you would if you were manually typing in your terminal, but do so in Python script form. Then obviously there's hopefully a couple other kind of useful features and widgets and such that Scrapli provide that make your life a little bit easier. So before I kind of talk about Scrapli and demo it, I think it's worth looking at the most beautiful keynote drawing here in the whole wide world ever to talk about kind of what the core components are of Scrapli, because I think if you have a little bit of information about how it's built, it'll help make things make a lot more sense, and it'll just be kind of more intuitive. So Scrapli is basically built in three major components. Then obviously we've got our device kind of hanging out here on the right. So there's the driver, and I probably should rename this driver here. There's the driver, the channel, and the transport. And the driver is kind of like a manager. It doesn't really do anything by itself, but it kind of binds the other components together and provides you the actual interface or the API that you interact with when you use Scrapli. So there is a base driver called Scrape, and all of the other drivers inherit from this ultimately. Inheriting from Scrape is another driver that's a little bit more kind of built out called the network driver, and then inheriting from the base network driver, there's ISXE, ISXR, NXOS, EOS, and Junos drivers, basically covering the kind of core Napalm platforms. So Scrape by itself obviously accepts all the arguments and such that you would need to in order to connect to a device, username, password, and all that kind of stuff. But by itself, Scrape really provides kind of no intelligence. It's just there to provide you the SSH or Telnet session or channel and let you send commands and get data back from it. The network driver basically builds upon that and adds in things that you kind of might be familiar with, stuff like dealing with disabling paging or privilege escalation. Like if you need to send configs, you obviously need to get into like conf mode in Cisco world. So the network drivers are going to basically handle that for you. So I suspect that pretty much most people that use Scrapli would probably want to be using a network driver. However, if you wanted a way less opinionated, like literally to the point of almost doing nothing for you, you'd have to, disable paging, handle logins, or privilege escalation for yourself. You could use that on the Scrape driver. So Scrape's a good choice if you have like a weird one-off task you need to do on like a wireless LAN controller that might be a little different, or a Linux box or whatever. The next component is the channel. This is probably like the most important part of Scrapli, I'd say. This is what actually takes input from Scrape and sends it to the transport, takes output from transport and sends it back to Scrape. So it's kind of like a middleman here in that it's just passing data. It's not really doing a whole lot by itself, but this is where Scrape interacts with, or the network drivers ultimately interact through this channel to send data to the device. And that channel sends and receives from the transport, and the transport is, in its simplest form, it's really SSH or Telnet. So there's some other boxes down here. I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. But transport is providing that actual connection, right? The actual bytes going to and from the device. So that's transport's purpose. So obviously pretty critical kind of component there. Then of course it is what's ultimately talking to the device. So to kind of sum up, three major components: the driver, the channel, and the transport. I kind of mentioned those a lot in the docs and stuff. So those words or kind of ideas are useful to know. Got our lovely hiking person here standing on top of the driver or the Scrape over here, because that's really where you as a user are going to interact with Scrapli. You don't probably oftentimes need to interact with either of these other components. And the rocket ship is just because rocket ships are cool and I like rocket ships. And Scrapli is supposed to be fast, and rocket ships are fast. So that's all that's for. So if you want to use Scrapli, you can install it in a few different ways. So I've just got this virtual environment. All I did was upgrade pip, so I didn't have the annoying your pip version's out of date message here. So brand new virtual environment, nothing going on here. We can go ahead and pip install Scrapli, and we'll see that basically almost nothing happens. Obviously cached and blah, blah, blah. But Scrapli by itself has 0 dependencies, like literally none, just standard library is all it requires. If you want to use Paramiko or SSH to net, SSH to Python as a transport, which we'll kind of talk about toward the end of this video, you can go ahead and pip install extras to install those, or just manually install them yourself, whatever you want to do. But Scrapli by itself, that's really it. If you wanted to install from source, you can go ahead and do that. cd Scrapli pip install, just in that directory, and go ahead and install it just like that. And of course, if you were so inclined to install a specific branch, you can absolutely do that. In this case, we'll just install the develop branch, which would probably be what you would want to do if you were installing a specific branch, because you'd want to install to get a latest greatest feature or something like that. So in any case, there are a few ways to kind of get Scrapli installed. None of them are terribly difficult, so you've got those options. Now, if you want to actually use Scrapli, which I suspect you probably would, the kind of key thing to keep in mind, let me pull this back up, you need to figure out what driver you want to use first. That's really the starting point. So for purposes of this demo, I've got a ISXE box running in VRNet Lab, so I'm going to just use that. So I'm just obviously going to pick the ISXE driver. Again, if you're living within one of or interacting with one of these 5 kind of core platforms or core napalm platforms, you probably almost certainly want to use the actual explicit driver for that. If you have something kind of one-off or not supported down here, you might use the base kind of scrape driver and roll your own, if you will. Probably another good thing to note, ISXE should work on iOS. I don't see why it wouldn't. Obviously iOS and vanilla iOS and ISXE have a lot in common there. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy paste a little bit here so that I don't screw up typing. But if you want to import any of those drivers from scrapli.driver.core, and we can import any of those 5 drivers. In this case, again, we'll just pick on that one. Now, pretty common pattern you've probably seen before is creating a dictionary that represents the device that you want to connect to. So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly that. I've got my host here, auth username, VRNet Lab, auth password, blah, blah, blah. Nice and easy. And what we can do is then we can create this connection object from our ISXE driver, or with our ISXE driver. And important thing to note, Scrapli does not open the connection for you. So at this point, this connection, we've got this lovely connection object. This is not open. Absolutely nothing's happened. We haven't gone out and kind of interacted with that device in any way, shape, or form. It's just a connection object. Now, if I go ahead and call open, I suspect this should fail. Sure enough. So another really important thing about Scrapli is by default, Scrapli is going to enable strict SSH key checking. So obviously this doesn't apply if you're using Telnet, but if you're using SSH, which probably you are, strict key checking is enabled. So you can see here in that base connection object that we created, auth strict key is equal to true. So we need to go ahead and disable that if we want to connect to this. It's a lab device and it's getting built and destroyed all the time. So keys are changing and all that kind of thing. In production, maybe you don't have this problem, but I certainly do in the lab here. So now I can go ahead and, open this connection, and obviously didn't get an exception, so probably off to a much better start there. Again, we can just go ahead and take a look at that connection object. Strict key is now false, so of course we're looking much better. If we take a look at, if we run dir against this connection object, we can see, just like a normal kind of Python class, lots of stuff going on. There's a handful of options in here, or methods in here, that the network drivers provide, and there's probably there's 6 public methods really, and there's 5 that you probably really care about. So we've got 4 here: send command, send command, send config, send interactive, and then the other one, get prompt. The other public method is acquire priv. You probably don't need to think about that one too much. But in any case, these methods, hopefully pretty intuitive. They should do kind of more or less what you'd expect. Send command sends a single command. Send command sends a list of commands and returns a list of responses. Send config sends a config or a list of configs. It's going to go ahead and get into enable mode if you're using one of these network device drivers for you. It's going to handle that privilege escalation and de-escalation when you're done. That's going to do all that for you. And then get prompt is exactly what it sounds like. It's just going to get the current prompt. So we can go ahead and kind of start with that. See CSR 1000p, that's just the prompt, the host name of my VRNet lab ISXE box there. If we wanted to, let's just say response is equal to con.send command. Let's just say show version. If I can type here. Oop, got to type the right thing all of the places. So now I've got this lovely response object. An important thing to note about Scrapli is there isn't a, it doesn't just return the text of what happened. It actually returns a response object. If you use send command, it returns a single response object. If you use send commands, it returns a list of response objects, one for every single command that you send. And this response object, just kind of see real quick, is just a Scrapli response type. And if we take a look at it, trying to type and talk, we can see, again, it's just another object. Some things that you might care about. We store the host that the command was ran against, the start time. Somewhere in here is like end time, elapsed time. There's a failed, which isn't really used yet, but hopefully will be in the future. There's a text FSM parse output. So this method is going to take the command, the platform, in this case Cisco ISXE, and the text output and try to parse it against text FSM and NTC templates. Obviously, you'd have to have those things installed, and we'll return back structured data regardless of whether it passes or is able to parse it or not. In any case, we just probably want to look at response.result, and sure enough, not very beautiful because it's just here in the REPL, but we can see certainly that we got everything that we were looking for. The other kind of quirky one, maybe quirky, is send interactive. Send interactive, to get started, you probably don't need to deal with it, but this is what you're going to use if you need to interact with any kind of prompts and you don't want to do it manually. Of course, you can just use the methods to do whatever you want manually, but if you wanted to deal with a prompt that send a command, expect some response, send some response back to that response, and then see what the kind of finale is, that send interactive method is going to do that. So probably you would use that for things like maybe commits on those devices that support that, or clear logging is the one that I test in the lab just to kind of make sure it's working, or anything like from the device that's going to prompt you basically. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. So a couple things just to call out. Wanted to kind of go back and we can take a look at the docs here. I've tried to document everything. There's a lot of docs, maybe a little overboard, but it was useful for me to write all this stuff down, and hopefully it's useful for anyone trying to take Scrapli for a test drive. So a few things to note. There's a quick start guide that's just to install and get going. A little bit of kind of stuff up here. Supported platforms, again, those are going to be the Napalm platforms. Probably also worth mentioning, I have no idea if this works on Windows. I don't have a Windows box to test on. I'll probably, in the shortish term, start trying to test it on Windows. But for now, no idea. If you're on Windows, WSL is awesome. Sigwin should work just fine. Or just obviously a Linux VM would be fantastic. Mac OS, like myself, obviously works just fine. So just that's probably an important call out. The basic usage section has a couple good kind of tidbits for getting started. As we mentioned, obviously you got to pick the right driver. EOS driver here in this example, obviously I used the ISXE driver, but basically just map your platform to the driver, kind of common sense there. The basic driver arguments, we saw some of these. We saw host, username, password, and strict key. There we go. This table is not the extensive table of what's supported. This is just the common stuff that you would need. Auth secondary would be like for enable password. We can point to an SSH config file or just say true, and Scrapli is going to try to find your SSH config file in your user directory or the system default, something like etc SSH config. Do note that a lot of this stuff is really POSIX focused, so just keep that in mind. Definitely, it's a very Linux or any POSIX really focused library. All right. Talk about opening and closing. Yeah, we don't need to go through all that. You all can go ahead and read that. Some other things that are probably worth calling out. Timeouts in Scrapli. So timeouts are pretty critical, obviously. Scrapli has 3 timeouts, which is either a lot or a little, I guess, depending on your perspective. But they each kind of govern their own thing. And my hope is that they're kind of intuitive and simple, and obviously the user can change these at any time with their connection object. So hopefully this is useful. This first one, timeout socket. It's really what it sounds like. This is spinning up that initial socket to your device, that initial connection to your device, in one way or the other. Depends a little bit on the transport that you're using, what exactly this governs, but think of this as the initial connection timeout. After that, we have the timeout transport, and the timeout transport is basically the timeout for not having anything happening on the transport connection. So whether that's Telnet or SSH of any of the flavors, if there's nothing at all happening on that transport, this timeout is what's going to govern that. So if you go 50 seconds or whatever you set this to, or whatever defaults are, and you have literally no data going in or out, then this connection is going to time out. And probably the most important one is timeout ops. Timeout ops is a timeout that basically decorates operations in Scrapli. And so this means that any single send command, any single send config is governed by this timeout. So if you needed, but you could just leave it for the default for probably almost any scenario. But if you had to get show tech off a device or some ridiculous long command off a device, you might need to crank this timeout up, because if the show command, the send command, or whatever is not done, it's not completed, Scrapli hasn't got kind of to the end of whatever was happening, and the timeout is hit, Scrapli is going to raise an exception. So that's obviously pretty critical. So my hope, again, is that these are relatively intuitive. They're not, they're not the most crystal clear, because there's just kind of a lot going on, but hopefully they make sense. Keepalives is a bit of a weird one. If you wanted to have a connection alive basically forever, obviously exec timeouts and stuff, again, using kind of Cisco words just because that's what I'm familiar with, but an exec timeout defaults to like 60 minutes or something like that. So after 60 minutes of non-activity, device is going to kill your connection. In the networking world, you might not have the option to send an actual standard SSH Keepalive. If you can, that's great. Scrapli supports it with SSH2 and system transports. But if not, and because ISXE, for example, doesn't run OpenSSH, runs some kind of custom version of SSH, we can actually go ahead and send what I call a network Keepalive. And this is basically, typo, gotta fix that. And this is basically sending an innocuous character on the channel, such that there is activity on the channel and that exec timer kind of resets. And in this case, it basically sends a control E on the channel. This Keepalive stuff is not enabled by default, so it doesn't get in your way and do anything weird by default, but you can enable it. The Keepalives happen in their own thread, basically in parallel to your kind of normal Scrapli operations. So again, I'm not going to go into this anymore, but just know that this is a thing that exists, and if you don't want to use it, that's fine, because it's not enabled by default. Driver privilege levels. Oof, this is kind of a big one. So this is maybe the most kind of magic piece of Scrapli, and I say magic not in necessarily a positive way, but in a way that there's kind of a lot going on here, and I don't know that I love it, kind of as a maintainer and as a creator, and the complexity that this adds. But Scrapli obviously needs to understand privilege levels on a device if we're going to say, send configs and send it a list of configs to send, Scrapli needs to know to get into that configuration mode, whatever that is, whether it's just configure Juniper box or conft on the other platforms. Scrapli needs to know that and know when it's in config mode and when it's not in config mode. Because if you send configs, obviously at like an exec, like a privilege level 1 type thing, it's probably not going to work that well. So all that said, Scrapli basically has this concept of privilege levels. These are all set for you for the core platform, so you hopefully don't have to worry about them. But this section of documentation kind of talks about what these privileges are and how they are used basically in Scrapli. Again, hopefully that's not something that you really need to think about too often. Okay, probably the last major documentation section here. So using a different transport. So if we go back to that beautiful drawing with the rocket ship, we've got 4 different types of transport that are supported in Scrapli. By default, Scrapli is going to use what's called the system transport. And this is literally system SSH. So again, focused on POSIX systems. If you're on a terminal and you type SSH, that's exactly the same SSH that Scrapli is going to use. This has a huge benefit of all of your normal SSH kind of workflows, operations, whatever you want to call it, are just natively supported. So for me, for example, every day I connect to jump host for work, and we have control persist and my 2FA, and I enter that, and now I've got control persist, and if I need to connect through to devices on my network, connections are proxied through that jump host, and off I go. Because I've already set up that the control persist and 2FA once, I don't have to deal with it every single time. Obviously there's like timeouts and such like that, but so Scrapli is just natively going to work with that. I don't have to do anything. So that's the system SSH. That's the focus of Scrapli. That's the goal of Scrapli. Supporting 100% of OpenSSH is really the goal. And the only way to do that, in my mind, is to just literally use the same SSH that you as a user would use. And so that's exactly what Scrapli does by default. Does this work on Windows? Again, no, I really doubt this part works on Windows, but I don't know, and I don't particularly care. So I don't have a Windows box, so it kind of doesn't matter a whole lot to me. That said, if you do have a Windows box and you don't want to use WSL or whatever, Scrapli also supports 2 other SSH drivers, or transports. Excuse me, I should say transports. And those are Paramiko, which probably most folks are familiar with, as well as SSH to Python. Now, SSH to Python is ridiculously fast because it's a really thin wrapper around C, libSSH2. So it's just as low level as you can kind of get in Python without going to a different language, like literally doing stuff in C or Go or whatever. Now, is the benefit of speed there as compared to system SSH or Paramiko? Yeah, it's a little faster. Generally, we're IO bound, waiting on network devices, stuff like that. So, maybe it's important to you, maybe not, I don't know. But SSH to Python is available. And then, of course, Paramiko as well. And all 3 of these SSH transport types, the goal is to kind of stay as close to feature parity between the 3 of them as possible. It's probably not going to happen. I mean, certainly control persist, I don't think is supported in either of the other things, but obviously works in system SSH. So anyway, some kind of food for thought with that. Again, the default is system, which is basically assuming you're on a POSIX system. And then the last transport is Telnet lib. Again, Telnet lib standard library, so you don't have to install anything. Paramiko SSH to Python, you have to pip install, or use pip to install Scrapli extras, and you can install those as well. But Telnet obviously it's just Telnet instead. Important thing to note about Telnet: if you do use Telnet, you must explicitly set the port, because we just default to port 22 for everything with Scrapli. So, bit of a minor annoyance, but just bear with me and take care of that. Okay. There's a lot of stuff. Obviously, there's more. Tried to write all the things here and talk about how it's tested and roadmap stuff and yada yada yada. So there's more there. At this point, probably a pretty reasonable, rational question would be, why would you care about Scrapli? How does Scrapli compare to other things, whatever those things are? So I think the obvious comparisons are Paramiko, NetMiko, and Ansible. Yeah. So I'll just kind of throw Ansible out right away because realistically, this is just a low-level Python library. If you wanted to use it as the SSH driver in a module for Ansible, that would be one thing. But Scrapli and Ansible are really kind of apples to oranges. Scrapli and NetMiko are really kind of the same when you compare either of them to the Paramiko. The point of Scrapli and NetMiko is that there's a lot more network awareness. It's a bit higher level, so you don't have to deal with as much low-level junk as Paramiko does. So I'd say kind of if you're evaluating this versus Paramiko, and you've evaluated NetMiko versus Paramiko, you probably have basically the same considerations there. And then Scrapli versus or against or compared to whatever NetMiko. Scrapli, more modern, I'd say. It's just I don't have any users at this point, so I've been able to just iterate really quickly and change the API kind of to my heart's content. That said, I think it's in a stable place right now, and I'll probably be much more mature around making changes at this point. But that lack of users is just kind of a good thing and a bad thing, I guess, has really given me a lot of flexibility to change this and iterate quick and just kind of make it into whatever I want it to be. So that's been a really big benefit. Scrapli is really well typed. Like my PyStrict type checking is ran every time I lint. So that's really nice if you have like PyCharm or VS Code or whatever your IDE of choice is. The typing is super useful for that. Super well documented, or biased obviously, but I'm really OCD about that. So I think the documentation is pretty reasonable. It's definitely not perfect. It's always room for improvement, but definitely well documented. And I think the API is just kind of sane. I don't think it's doing a whole lot. So it's pretty straightforward. Hopefully others think that as well. And then the last kind of thing I would just say that Scrapli was intended from the get-go to be fast. It's very much built to be fast, and it is generally pretty damn fast. So that's a big kind of point of why you might care about Scrapli. And then lastly, that open SSH support is really, for me personally, is very useful. NetMiko is going to do a lot more stuff for you. There's no write or save config method in Scrapli, whereas there is obviously that in NetMiko. There's no SCP in Scrapli. Obviously, there's that in NetMiko. NetMiko is obviously much wider known. There's lots of support, lots of users, all of that kind of thing. So much more apples to apples than say Scrapli and Ansible. But neither is better or worse or whatever. They're just different. So hopefully, if you stuck with me through this nearly half an hour, thank you, and hopefully give Scrapli a bit of a test drive and see if it works for you. And I'd be really interested in hearing any feedback, positive or negative. Kind of about all aspects, documentation, typos. I think I saw a typo while we were doing this. Ways to improve it from a speed perspective. That's a big focus. Not necessarily because I think that's super critical, but just because it's fun to go fast. I like to go fast. Feature ads, different platforms, and all that kind of stuff. I'd definitely be interested in hearing about it all. And then the last thing I'll say is, as Nornir 3.0 comes out, I will try to get a Scrapli driver or plugin for Nornir. It already works kind of in a beta state right now, but if you're using Nornir and want to try out Scrapli, hopefully you'll be able to do that here pretty quickly. So thanks, and let me know what you guys think.